Let me show you something. Come on. What's going on, guys? Here today I have what might be the most overlooked vintage lens for adapting to mirrorless cameras. Before I jump into what makes this little guy so special, I'd like to talk a little bit about adapting vintage lenses to mirrorless cameras. Vintage lenses were initially designed to work with film cameras. With the development of the digital SLR, a lot of camera manufacturers ditched these old film mounts for new mounts that worked better with the digital sensors and technologies like autofocus. And as a result, some of the most gorgeous glass fell into the annals of history. However, with mirrorless cameras, photographers and cinematographers have found a way to adapt these old vintage lenses onto their new cameras, breathing a new life into some of this gorgeous glass. Which leads me to my favorite lens, the Minolta 50mm f2. So how did I find this lens? As a photographer and a college student, my budget is generally very tight. And when I switched to Sony a few years back, they had most of their G Master line set up, but not much outside of that. So Sony had developed a reputation for being a very expensive system to buy into, but I knew I wanted to switch. And when I went to go look for budget options, I found vintage lenses very quickly, as there were a few other options, but mostly vintage lenses was the ultra budget way to go. So imagine me a few years ago, just sifting through the interwebs. I'm just looking for everything. I'm looking for anything and everything about vintage lenses. I knew that vintage lenses had a lot of character. That's kind of what they're known for. There's a lot with crazy bokeh. There's a lot with really weird effects that you could get, but being the young amateur photographer that I was and still am, the number one thing I wanted was sharpness, even wide open. Yes, you heard me right. I expected a vintage lens to be sharp, wide open. If you are a fan of vintage lenses, you know that this is extremely difficult to find, if not impossible. So eventually, in all this research, I stumble upon Philip Reeves's site, philipreeve.net. And I was looking for a review of the Minolta 50mm f1.7, a slightly faster and older variant. But Philip had a particularly glowing review of this lens, the Minolta 50mm f2. And I was very skeptical at first because I'd never heard of it. But some of the images he took with it were just gorgeous. And it was all, I found it on eBay for about 30 bucks. I had to try it. So I ordered it. Now I know what some of you are thinking. David, you can't use vintage lenses. There's so much chromatic aberration. Oh my God. There's not any resolution or sharpness. You just can't use that. I get it. But before you judge, take a look at what this lens can create.
That's good.
So those were some of the images I was able to create with that lens. Some of them were on my full frame Sony A7, some of them were on my APS-C Sony A6000. I personally find the image quality to be comparable on both sensors. Surprisingly, I actually do find this lens to be pretty sharp wide open at f2. At f2, contrast is a little bit on the weak side, and it gets punchier as you stop down, but even the little bit of contrast you lose at f2 can easily be corrected or added in post. While this lens doesn't have any particularly unique bokeh, I do find that you can get a little bit of that soap bubble goodness when you have a nice bit of foliage behind you. As a result of this, you definitely get a subtle yet unique look that really stands out from most modern lenses. Another thing I love about this lens is that it's just incredibly lightweight and small, even with the adapter on. And as a result of this, I kind of find it hard to excuse not throwing it in my bag when I go out to shoot. However, with all lenses, this does have shortcomings. Being a vintage lens, it suffers from most of the issues that all vintage lenses suffer from. First of all, this is a very old lens. It does not benefit from modern coatings and technologies. So as a result, it does get significant chromatic aberration. If you take a look at this photo of my GTI, you can see up in the trees in the corner, there is a lot of that magenta and green nastiness. And anytime there's a super hard contrast edge where chromatic aberration would be particularly apparent, it really is strong and makes itself known. This can be corrected in post, but it's kind of a pain when it's this strong. Another downside of having such an old lens with such an old coating is that it flares pretty bad. Now, vintage lenses are sometimes sought out because they produce really unique flares. If you look at this one photo I took of my friend Brian, you can artistically use the flare in such a way that it really gives your photo a unique look. But this lens does not have good flaring at all. If you look at this photo I took during this grad shoot I did with my friend Alexis, I was trying to get the sun to flare behind over her shoulder, but I really got more than I was bargaining for. And as you can see, it not only isn't uniform, but it's extremely strong. So it's just a very nasty look, and I really would avoid shooting with the sun in the frame. Another drawback related to the age of this lens is that it is all manual. It has a manual focus ring and a manually clicked aperture. Now, some people find this as a negative. I personally find it to be a bit of a positive because back in the day when these were all manual, they really worked hard to make the user experience really, really nice. And Minolta was some of the best at doing this. The focus ring on this lens is really smooth. The aperture clicking is very affirmative. It's just a really nice experience. It has this nice knurling on the focus ring as well. I'm a very tactile person, and this is probably my favorite lens to use and operate. If you can maybe get a little bit of this sound, you can really hear. It just has such a nice feel. It's nice and weighted. It's really buttery. Just absolutely excellent. The little clicks, absolutely wonderful. And finally, I've said it a bunch of times already, this is an old lens. This particular model came out in 1981, which means that pretty much every copy of it is going to have almost 40 years of wear and tear from the earth upon it. That means that there is going to be dust, debris, fungus in a ton of these lenses. The focus ring grease will have dried out over time. So you have to work really hard to make sure you're getting a clean copy. If you check on eBay, a lot of the sellers coming out of Japan have rated them and pre-tested them. I personally find them to be some of the most reliable. Their ratings are always accurate as well as their descriptions. So if you're going to get one and you're willing to wait, I highly suggest getting it from some of these Japanese sellers. Overall, for $30, I find it hard to have a reason not to buy this lens. It is cheap, it works great, it gives a unique look, and if you want it, it could be your primary 50mm. I still recommend having an autofocus 50mm, but if you really want a unique look, this will give it to you without sacrificing too much resolution, too much sharpness. It'll still hang in with its modern counterparts. I highly recommend it. If you're interested in purchasing one of these, I will have an affiliate link below down to eBay where you can check out some of the listings. If you've made it this far in the video, please like, comment, subscribe. I'll be sure to get some more of these out, sharing some of my favorite vintage lenses with you. We definitely have a lot more coming down the line. Thank you so much.